The hand of the Lord feeds us. He answers all our needs. My dear sisters and brothers, today we begin a new message series called Eucharist. And because the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, we would like to look at it from three different angles. First of all, Eucharist as a meal. The next weekend, the Eucharist as a sacrifice. And the third week, the Eucharist as a real presence. And the following weekend, we would like to take a closer look at the Mass that we celebrate week after week. In fact, day after day. And so this weekend, we want to sit with the theme, Eucharist as a meal. Or what does it mean? What could it mean when we say one bread, one body? Right from the start, God has been doing one thing, and one thing only. He has been feeding us. The hand of the Lord has been feeding us in every possible way. Notice the first thing that He does, as we read in the scriptures, He plants the garden, and the whole world is a beautiful garden. And He tells Adam and Eve, a stand-in for you and for me, you can eat of the fruits of all the trees of the garden. Here is God feeding us. That is how we should be, fed by the Lord. And then Adam and Eve, that is you and I, we get an idea. We want to feed ourselves. We want to grow to what we want to grow to. And so what do? Instead of allowing the hand of the Lord to feed us, we stretch out our hand and we grab what should actually be received with open hands. That is how a gift is received. For me, that is the story of sin. We feeding ourselves. We grabbing, stretching out our hand and taking and saying, for me, for myself. And so there is this momentum that is upset. And what does God do throughout the rest of the scriptures, the Bible, the Old and the New Testament? He prepares the stage for the arrival of His Son, who would reverse that momentum of the Garden of Eden. What began with a bad meal would be rectified and remedied and set right by that perfect meal, the Eucharist. If you ask me for one reason why I chose to be a priest, it's the Eucharist. And the Eucharist as a meal. Now, when you break bread with someone, with some persons, day after day after day, what are they to you? In one word, family. And that is what God does with the Eucharist, as He feeds us with the body and blood of His Son. He makes us family. God belongs to us, and we belong to God. Let's go back to the very beginning. 1200 years before the arrival of Christ, God began the work of enabling dependency. There was this people wandering through the desert, Israelites, for 40 years. And instead of letting them fend for themselves, and they would have definitely found a way out of that situation, God would bring manna from the skies, and he would feed them day after day after day. And that is where we say in the prayer of Jesus, give us today our daily bread. There is a logic behind that madness. And God says, take what is sufficient for the day. So every day, a person from the Israelite household would come out with a little basket or vessel and collect what was needed for that day, for that family, and go back. And if a family got greedy, avaricious, and they wanted to stack and store for a rainy day, that food would turn into a basket of worms. God wanted them to lean on to Him, to depend on Him. Now, that food had a magical effect on these people, a strange effect on them. When these people, day after day, came out and collected the food, they looked around and there were many others who were dependent on God. And gradually, they became one people, one nation, truly under God, not like us. Truly did they place their trust in Him for God to feed them. And so, one bread, one people. Now, all was not a fairy tale, process. There were people who did not like to be there. There were people who did not want to be there. There were people who couldn't stand the scorching sun. And there were those people who were sick or handicapped, who were delaying the movement of the group. And self-sufficiently would come in and say, I need to be independent. Those people can be left behind. They are not like me. They are different. Leave them alone. Let's go on. And nowhere in the scriptures do I find any reason for any person to be left behind. Everyone was family. Everybody belonged to God. One bread, one people, one bread, one nation under God, in God whom they trusted. Now, Jesus would come bursting onto the scene 20 centuries later, or 22 centuries later. And what does He do? He takes that same bread, physically, objectively, and He would also use it symbolically, but really. And He would say, my body broken for you, my blood shed for you, this food given up for you. Take it, eat it, take it, drink it. And then He goes on to say something. Be with me for a minute. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink His blood, you do not have life in you. If you eat my flesh and drink my blood, I will raise you up on the last day. And so Jesus would really want us to eat of this food and drink of this food, and wants us to be dependent on this food. That is why, my sister and brother, you and I come for Mass week after week, to be fed by the Lord, to be nourished and nurtured by Him. And so what is Jesus telling us? That as we go through our own desert experience in our day-to-day life, and I do see a lot of people hurting, like Sigrid who comes. Today I see her for the first time, though she's been here for 2-3 weeks. She comes after laying to rest the cremated remains of her husband in Germany. I see the Banduchis. They are here for the first time, having lost their son Mike just yesterday morning. And so what God tells us is, as we go through our own desert experience of loss and limits, of tears and defeat, of broken bones and broken hearts, with our own missteps and mistakes, we can still depend on this love come down from heaven that we call the Eucharist. That is one bread that makes us not just one people, the people of God. It does more. This one bread makes us one body, the body of Christ. So look at the bread and wine that is brought up in procession. It is transformed, transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. And later, as you and I come up and eat it and drink it, we become the body of Christ, the members of the body of Christ. We are made God's own family. God belongs to us and we belong to God. And there is one other thing happening. As you and I come together with all the others, everybody becomes the body of Christ. And so we need to realize that all of us belong together. The problem is that sometimes we forget that we belong to one another and together we belong to God. One bread, one body. And in the second reading we read, one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, the Father of us all. We are family to God and we are family to one another. And that is why I have this nagging question that torments me. Eucharist, the body of Christ, is that something that I welcome people with or I regulate people with? Jesus always had an open table fellowship because he knew that he belonged to all and all belonged to God. And so, my sister and brother, as we are grateful to God for the gift of the Eucharist as a meal, for this one bread that makes us one body, let's celebrate that we belong to God and God belongs to us, that together we belong to God and to one another. Anything less than this, we disqualify ourselves from breaking bread together. If you forget all that I told you, I hope you will remember this, just this. When you break bread with someone, you become their family and they become yours. That's what you and I do together. With all the differences that we have, we are one body because of the one bread. That's a privilege, and that is a responsibility as well. And so let's thank God for the one bread that makes us one body.